Welcome to the Deep Dive. We've got quite a bit of material here today. Articles, analyses, all looking at Taiwan. Tensions across the Strait seem to be constantly in the news, and there's this real fear about potential conflict. But looking through these sources you provided, our goal here isn't just, talk about the military side. It's really to unpack what these analyses say about the economics, the politics, the societal stuff. What's really driving the situation.
Exactly. And you see it right away in the material. While things like those March 31st drills near Taiwan certainly highlight the military aspect, the core point really across these sources is that the economic fallout from a conflict, it would be, the words used are severe, far-reaching, even potentially catastrophic.
Okay, so let's dig into that economic piece first. What's the main vulnerability the sources are pointing to for China?
The biggest one seems to be just how much China relies on its exports. I mean, any major conflict, it's almost certain they face significant international isolation. You'd see sanctions, maybe blockades, definitely Western retaliation. And the analysis here predicts that would hammer their trade. We're talking potential factory closures and rising unemployment on a large scale within China.
Right. And it's not just sanctions, is it?
No, the sources also mention multinational companies. They're already hedging their bets, accelerating moves to shift production out of China to places like India, Vietnam, Mexico. A conflict would just pour fuel on that fire.
It really strikes me how the sources emphasize that modern supply chains aren't like the self-sufficient economies people imagine from, say, World War II.
Yeah.
They're these incredibly tangled networks. China might be the world's factory, but it depends heavily on getting foreign technology, specific raw materials, key components. It can't wall itself off.
Precisely. And it's not just trade. Think about the financial side. Conflict means capital flight money rushing out. That weakens their currency, the yuan. Beijing would probably slap on capital controls, sure, but that can spook investors even more, and limit the foreign cash they need. Plus, the material highlights this could really worsen the problems in their already fragile real estate sector. That's a huge part of their domestic autonomy.
Okay, this is where, for me, it gets really fascinating. The sources spend a lot of time on Taiwan's unique role, specifically with semiconductors. The numbers are just, wow. Taiwan makes 65% of the world's semiconductors and almost 90% of the advanced chips. The sources are clear. You can't just replicate that overnight. Taiwan's role is described as critical and difficult to replace.
And disrupting that flow, it would send shockwaves, as one source puts it, through basically everything. Consumer electronics, cars, communications, even advanced military defense systems globally rely on those chips. But here's the twist the analyses point out. China itself is incredibly dependent on Taiwan, specifically on TSMC, for the most advanced chips it needs for its own tech sector.
So it's a kind of mutual dependence.
In a big way. The argument in some of this material is that China blocking chip imports from Taiwan would be like shooting itself in its own foot.
Yeah.
There's even a quote attributed to the TSMC chairman saying their factories would become inoperable if invaded. Why? Because they rely on international supply chains for materials, equipment, software. He apparently said, quite bluntly, nobody can control TSMC by force.
That's a powerful point. So this semiconductor interdependence acts as a kind of strong deterrent, as the sources put it.
That seems to be a key takeaway from the economic analysis. Yes, it's a huge factor.
And the U.S. recognizes this vulnerability too, right? The sources mention Washington calling the situation untenable and unsafe, and things like the GPS Act trying to build up domestic production.
Yes, but the sources also pour a little cold water on that, suggesting that matching Taiwan's current advanced chip capacity, that's likely going to take decades. It's not a quick fix.
Okay, so the economic costs look potentially devastating. But let's say, hypothetically, Beijing decided to stomach those costs. What about the actual military operation? The sources seem pretty clear on that, too.
Oh, absolutely. They paint a picture of immense difficulty. An amphibious invasion across the Taiwan Strait. It's described as potentially the most complex military operation in modern history. And the geography itself is a major hurdle. You've got the notoriously choppy strait, very few suitable landing beaches or deep water ports, shallow waters on the western side, meaning ships have to anchor way out.
Making them vulnerable targets.
Exactly. Plus, Taiwan can obviously target and destroy key entry points. And the East Coast, steep cliffs, very hard to assault.
There's a comparison in the sources that really stuck with me, saying a Taiwan invasion might need to dwarf D-Day in scale. Just imagine the logistics, the vulnerability of moving all those troops and all that heavy gear from ships miles offshore under fire.
It's staggering to contemplate, and Taiwan, according to this material, has been investing specifically to make any landing incredibly costly. Things like Mines, anti-landing spikes, mobile missile launchers, designed to exploit those geographic choke points.
And even if they get ashore.
Then you hit the terrain. It's mountainous, rugged, perfect for defenders, potentially for drawn-out guerrilla warfare, as the sources suggest.
Not to mention the cities.
Right. Taiwan is densely populated. Think about Taipei as 7 million people, the sources say. Any invading force would likely be forced into urban combat, fighting street by street. That means a slow, costly invasion. And one analysis points out China's military hasn't actually fought a major war in, well, more than 7 decades. That lack of recent large-scale combat experience is another factor.
Okay, so that covers the external challenges. But the sources also dive into what's happening inside Taiwan, politically. And this seems, well, quite complicated and significant according to the analysis.
Yes, it's a major theme. Several sources focus on what they describe as a surprising level of influence or sway the CCP appears to have achieved over Taiwan's main opposition party, the KMT. The material notes that their public statements and legislative actions seem increasingly highly aligned with Beijing's agenda, which is striking given that KMT and CCP were bitter enemies historically. It's called a new development.
And what specific actions are cited?
Well, since the KMT gained a majority in the legislature, the sources point to attempts to expand the legislature's powers in ways that could challenge the presidency, moves seen as defanging the constitutional court by holding up judicial appointments, and perhaps most controversially, efforts to cut the defense budget by 1.3% while freezing 13.9% of it pending review.
Wow. I see a quote here from U.S. Senator Dan Sullivan calling that playing a dangerous game on their defense budget. The concern expressed in some material is that Beijing might be acting like a de facto opposition party inside Taiwan's own government structure.
And is quite direct in some cases. The sources quote some senior KMT figures openly stating that the peaceful unification of this country is of course our ultimate goal, although they usually add it's not an immediate prospect.
How is this influence supposedly happening?
The sources allege the CCP uses vast resources, things like business deals and favors for KMT-connected companies, exclusive meetings with top Chinese officials, and even, reportedly, compromising information used as leverage.
Now, the KMT does have a counterargument presented in the sources, right?
Yes. Their stated position is that they're engaging with Beijing pragmatically to help Taiwanese businesses get trade restrictions lifted, promote peace, and, crucially, they claim this dialogue actually helps earn more time to build up our military deterrence capability. So different perspectives on their motivations.
But how is the Taiwanese public reacting to all this?
That's where it gets really interesting. The material describes Taiwanese civil society as becoming energized. People are organizing recall votes, targeting specific KMT legislators they see as too close to Beijing. And the polling data cited is very consistent. An overwhelming majority identify as Taiwanese, not Chinese, and reject unification. Support for unification is apparently under 7%, while huge majorities favor either maintaining the current status quo indefinitely or moving towards eventual formal independence. Big disconnect there.
Okay, let's shift focus across the strait again, but not to the military. The sources talk about something called the silent front. What's that referring to?
It refers to Chinese public opinion. The idea presented in some of this analysis is that public opinion inside China is a factor that maybe hasn't been fully considered an underutilized asset, potentially, for Taiwan's security.
How so?
Because, ultimately, the CCP's primary goal is regime survival. And that survival, the argument goes, is fundamentally rooted in public opinion. So if the Chinese public is perceived by the leadership to be deeply concerned about the costs of a war, the economic impacts, human costs, global audience costs, as the sources list them that could raise the decision threshold for force application, it makes leaders more hesitant.
And there's a specific point about casualties.
Yes. The one-child policy era means many families have only one child, often a son. The analysis suggests this could make the public more sensitive to casualties. There's even a quote reflecting a reported sentiment among some parents, reluctance to send my kid to the battlefield.
But, as the sources point out, actually measuring what people in China really think is incredibly hard, isn't it? With censorship and fear of speaking out?
Absolutely. That's a huge caveat. They call it preference falsification, people not saying what they truly believe. It's very difficult to get reliable data.
Still, the potential is there.
The potential is there, according to this line of thinking. If the leadership believes there could be significant public backlash against a costly war, it might incentivize them to lean toward a peace-oriented option, assuming the costs look too high.
Okay, one last major piece. the international reaction. If conflict did break out, what do the sources predict?
Unsurprisingly, a mixed bag. Responses would be varied and complex, driven mostly by national self-interest and how close countries are to the conflict zone. But there's a key finding that stands out. It is unlikely that any other states will come to Taiwan's aid if Taiwan does not fight fiercely and the United States does not intervene on a large scale.
So it really hinges on Taiwan's own defense and, crucially, the U.S. response.
Very much so. International reactions, especially military aid, seem heavily dependent significantly on U.S. capabilities and responses.
And who are the key players nearby?
Japan and the Philippines are highlighted as frontline states. They're U.S. allies, but also the most exposed to military retaliation from China, putting them in a tough spot. Further afield, Southeast Asian nations, likely to try and stay studiously neutral. European involvement, probably limited direct military action due to distance and their own uneven ties with China. And the analysis suggests much of the developing world would likely side with Beijing, or at least not oppose it.
And again, the economics seem central.
Definitely. Every country would face massive economic harm. So the sources predict a global balancing act, trying to protect their own economies, especially access to those critical semiconductors, while also wanting the conflict to end quickly just to stop the disruption.
Is there anything specific about semiconductors in the international response?
One interesting point mentioned is South Korea indicating it would likely cut off the chip supply to China if Washington imposed broad international sanctions. That could really impact China's and potentially Russia's ability to produce advanced military equipment reliant on those chips.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. Looking across these different sources, we see a picture of potentially crippling economic consequences, especially via semiconductors. We see an invasion painted as an incredibly difficult military undertaking for China.
Then there's the complex, and according to some sources, worrying political situation inside Taiwan itself with the KMT dynamics. And finally, this idea of Chinese public opinion as a potential, if hard to measure, break on conflict.
The consistent thread seems to be that launching a military assault would be, as the sources put it, a perilous gamble for Beijing, with potentially far more to lose than gain, particularly economically.
That does seem to be the dominant conclusion drawn from the analyses we looked at.
And the two absolute linchpins determining how things might play out if it came to that seem to be Taiwan's own will and ability to resist, and the scale and speed of the U.S. response.
Yes, those emerge as critical variables throughout the material.
So here's something for you, our listeners, to think about, drawing from all this. We see this reported alignment between parts of the KMT leadership and Beijing's unification goal. But we also see strong Taiwanese public opinion, reflected in polling, pushing firmly against that. How might that internal tension within Taiwan, that push and pull between certain political actors and broader public sentiment, continue to shape what happens across the Strait? And what could that mean for stability, not just regionally, but globally? Something to consider.